Thank you. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, which basically means mixing psychology and neuroscience together. And I bring people into my lab and I study the brain mechanisms that give rise to how they think, how they feel, how they interact, and how they make decisions. And today I'm going to share with you what we've learned about how people imagine the future and how this ability can lead to success, but also to some mistakes along the way. And I'm going to start by telling you the story of how I became interested in studying future thinking, which is maybe kind of an odd choice for a neuroscientist. So about 15 years ago, I was doing my PhD in New York University. And at the time, I wasn't interested in how people think about the future at all. I was interested in how people think about the past, and specifically how they remember very traumatic negative events from their past, such as 9/11. So if you think back to your experiences from 9/11, most people can remember with great vividness and detail where they were, what they were doing, who told them about it. It's as if you kind of click play and there's actually a video kind of going on inside your mind. And it turns out, quite interestingly, that those images are very vivid and detailed, but not necessarily accurate. And I was interested in how the brain generates those images. I was in New York on 9/11 doing research, and so I had the opportunity to bring people into the lab who were in Manhattan on that day, and I scanned the brains while they recalled the events of that day. And we identified two parts of the brain that were very important in generating these emotional memories. One part of the brain is called the amygdala. It's about the size of a cherry tomato. You have two of them, one on each part of your brain. It's deep inside your brain. And it's really important for emotion, for processing emotion, for identifying emotion. And it sits right next to another part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is very important for memory. And that's quite a clever design, because what happens is when something emotional happens, the two structures talk to each other, and they create these vivid images of these emotional things, which are presumably important. So I did my PhD, and then I went to Harvard to do a short postdoc. And when I got there, I learned that scientists there were saying that the system in the brain that we thought was evolved for memory perhaps wasn't evolved for memory at all, but rather was evolved to enable us to imagine the future and plan ahead. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you imagine what you're going to be doing tonight, or imagine your next summer vacation, what you're doing is you're taking bits and pieces of memories from your past, you're putting them together to combine something new. And so they were saying memory has evolved in order to enable us to imagine. And indeed, if you look at brain activity of people who remember the past and imagine the future, those patterns look very, very, very similar. There's some differences, but there's a lot of similarity. And amnesic patients who can't remember the past, they cannot imagine the future. So they can't tell you what happened yesterday, but they cannot tell you what they think is going to happen tomorrow. Kids evolve the ability to remember their past around the same time that they evolve the ability to imagine what's going to happen tomorrow. So that all suggests it's the same system, right? So I thought, well, it'll be super interesting to see if what we've identified as important for imagining negative traumatic events in the future, in the past, is also the same system that's important for imagining negative traumatic events that might happen to you in the future. So I was going to do an experiment, and the experiment was going to be super simple. Going to bring people into the lab, scan their brains while I give them specific negative events that is going to happen to them in the future, ask them to imagine it, then also ask them to remember similar events from the past and compare activity. But then something unexpected happened. Every time I gave my volunteers these negative events to imagine, they twisted and turned them to create something positive, or at least neutral. What they kept doing is solving the problem, right? So I say, imagine a breakup of a romantic relationship, and someone said, I broke up with my girlfriend, and then I found a better one. Or, now, granted, these were undergrads, but still. Or I would say, you get stuck out of your apartment, imagine that, no keys, and so someone said, I get stuck out of my apartment, I have no keys, I call the landlady, she comes in, she opens the door, everything's fine. So I was really upset because they were basically ruining my experiment. So for about couple of months, I tried different stimuli and different instructions to get them to do what I wanted them to do. And it took me some time, but then I felt, well, this is really interesting. I wonder what's going on. So I turned to the literature, and it turns out that in the literature in social psychology, there was quite a lot of studies describing something called the optimism bias, which is basically people's tendency to imagine the future as better than the past or the present. And it seemed that that's what was happening. So in order to kind of show you what I mean, I want you all to imagine your future. So imagine yourself 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Imagine your relationships, imagine your family, imagine your professional life, and really try to kind of come up with images and details. So first of all, who here comes up with positive images in their mind? Just put. Okay, so this is quite common. You see what I mean? Now I'm going to ask you 4 specific questions about your images. Number 1, if you're currently married, what is the likelihood that you will get divorced? 10%, 50%, 90%? So don't tell us, but just keep it in your mind. Number 2, how optimistic are you about your own family? Slightly optimistic, very optimistic, mildly optimistic. Number 3, how optimistic are you about the other families in this room? And number 4, what do you think is the likelihood that you'll prosper financially and professionally? And now let's see how other people answer these questions. I'm going to start with marriage. So in the Western world, divorce rates are about 40%. That means that out of every 5 couples walking down the aisle, 2 will end up splitting their assets. But if you ask newlyweds about their own likelihood of divorce, they estimate it at around 0%. And even divorce lawyers who should really know better hugely underestimate their own likelihood of divorce. Now, statistically speaking, optimists are not necessarily less likely to divorce, but they are more likely to remarry. In the words of Samuel Johnson, remarriage is a triumph of hope over experience. And if you're married, you're more likely to have kids, and we all think that our kids will be especially talented. These, by the way, are my own kids, Livia and Leo, and they're a really bad example of the optimism bias because they are especially talented, as you can see. And I'm not alone. Out of every 4 people, 3 said that they were optimistic about their own families. So that's 75%. But only 30% said that they thought that the next generation will be doing better than the current one. And this is a really important point because people tend to be optimistic about themselves, about their families, about their kids, but not necessarily about the guy sitting next to them. And we're somewhat pessimistic about the future of our country or the ability of our leaders. And that's true not only in the last 100 days. And one of the reasons for that is control. We feel we have a sense that we're in control over our own life. We can steer the wheel in the right direction, right? And that makes us optimistic about where we're going. But we don't think we're in control over where the country is going, over the world is going. We're not in control of what our leaders are doing, unfortunately. And so that leaves us with a sense of more pessimism about these other things that we feel we're not controlling. Take, for example, small business owners. So out of every 3 small business owners in the US, only 1 will remain standing in 5 years. So that's only 33%. But if you ask small business owners, they will tell you, 80% will say it is them that will remain standing. So that means that half of them are going to be unpleasantly surprised. So all these are examples of what we call the optimism bias, which is basically our tendency to imagine the future as better than the past or present, to overestimate, on average, the likelihood of positive events happening, and underestimate, on average, the likelihood of negative events happening. And we find this, again, on average, in 80% of the population, in females and males, in the Western world, in the non-Western world, in different ages. Now, it doesn't mean that we're optimistic about everything and every event and every part of our life, but it is an average, right? So we have this bias on average. And so then the question that people usually ask is, well, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? And the answer is yes. So on the the positive aspects, what we find is that all else being equal, optimists tend to be healthier, both physically and mentally. In fact, out of those 20% that I told you don't have a bias, half of them tend to have depression, either mild depression or severe depression. So what we find is that people with mild depression have no bias. It doesn't mean that they're more accurate. It just means that their mistakes, their errors, are on both directions. So sometimes they overestimate positive, underestimate negative, and sometimes they do the reverse, and on average it cancels each other out. People with severe depression, they tend to have what we know as a pessimistic bias. That means that they tend to think that the future will be worse than what's happening now, and they overestimate the negative, underestimate the positive. So optimism is related to mental health. It's also related to physical health. So all else being equal, optimists tend to live longer. They get over disease faster. There's two reasons for that. One is if we have positive expectations, that reduces stress and anxiety, and so that's good for our health. And the second reason is that optimists tend to do things to make them healthier. It's not they think, oh, I'm going to be fine. It's more they tend to eat healthily, go exercise, follow the doctor's orders, and that sort of thing. So that is health. But also optimism is related to success. Again, all else being equal, optimism is related to success in sports, in academia, in business, in politics. If we think our project is going to work out, if we think our company is going to work out, if we think we're going to find love, well, that means we put more effort into it, right? Otherwise, we don't even try. So if we think it's not going to work, we don't get out of bed, and it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And finally, optimism enables us to explore. If we think there's something positive out there for us to find, then we go and look for it, right? And so that relates to innovation and creativity as well. So I think all of these reasons together is why humans have evolved over time to become optimistic, to have this optimism bias. If you think about our ancestors going out of the cave to hunt, they had to have kind of a sense that they will come back, right? In order to leave Africa to explore the rest of the world, they had to A, imagine that there's something out there for them to find, unclear why they would do that, and B, that that thing is better than what they already have. And this is a really important point as well, because what optimism does, it frees us from the constraints of imagination, because imagination, as I told you already, is constrained by the past, right? We use our memories, we use what we have in our mind to imagine something new, and what optimism does, it enables us to imagine these positive new things. And let me give you an example. This is Daniel Kish. He's the director of the World Access for the Blind. He was blind since infancy. And so he was constrained to a world where navigation was quite difficult. But he imagined a world where he can navigate freely through busy streets, even on his bike, or go for a run, or play basketball. But in order to do that, he had to find a new innovative solution that didn't exist. And he had two advantages that eventually enabled him to succeed. One was he was highly motivated. He was blind himself, so he realized all the difficulties he had to endure navigation. The second reason is that he had knowledge of biology. He had a degree in biology, and so he knew that someone else has already solved this problem, specifically bats. So bats navigate through complete darkness, not using vision, but using sound, right? They create the sounds with their mouth. Those sounds create sound waves hitting objects around them, which then bring back echoes. The echoes reach their ears, and they use that information to figure out where things are. So Daniel imagined that he could do the same. He would make little ticking sound with his mouth or with a really easy device. Those ticking sounds will create waves. The waves will then hit objects around them. The objects will create echoes. The echoes will reach his ears, and then he will train his brain to transform those signals into visual signals, into understanding what's around him. And it seems a bit kind of impossible, but after enough training and after enough will, he was able to do that. And he now can ride his bike, play basketball, but also teach other blind people to do the same. And so this is an example where innovation involves taking bits of pieces of experiences and knowledge that we already have in our mind, but putting them together to create something new and being optimistic that we could do that and actually carry it forward. So these are some examples of the positive aspects to optimism, but what are the negative aspects? Well, if you underestimate your risk, you might not take the precautionary actions that you need to, right? If you underestimate risk, you might not wear a helmet when you're riding that bike, as you see Danielle did. You might not buy insurance when you need to. You might not go to medical screenings when you need to. There's also difficulties with planning. What optimism does, it tends to make us feel that projects will take less time than they actually do and cost less than they actually do. So these are the negative aspects. And if you take the financial collapse of 2008, for an example, a lot of economists say that the optimism bias was one of the main reasons for the financial collapse, where just people buying houses, taking mortgages, but also financial advisors and people in the government, everyone had these little optimism biases about what's going to happen into the market, and they came to create this really big bubble. So those are the negative aspects. But the point is that people don't just magically think that things will be okay, but they believe that they have the ability to do so. And so I'm a scientist, I do experiments. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to do a little experiment with you here. I'm going to give you a list of abilities and characteristics, and for each one, I want you to think where you stand relative to the rest of the population. So the first one is getting along well with others. Who here believes they're at the bottom 25% of getting along well with others? 2. Okay. Who believes they're at the bottom 50%? Top 50%? Okay, so you can see the kind of slight discrepancy here. Now do the same for your driving ability. How interesting are you? How attractive are you? How honest are you? And finally, how modest are you? So most people put themselves above average on most of these abilities. This, of course, statistically is impossible. We can't all be better than everyone else. But if we think we're more attractive, more interesting, well, that means we think, well, we're more likely to remain married, more likely to get that job. But still, what is fascinating here is how do we maintain this optimism in the face of reality? Because we go through life experiencing not only positive events, but experiencing also negative events. Right? We experience heartache, we experience failure, we read the newspapers, we know what's going on, and still we remain optimistic. And so this was a real puzzle for me as a neuroscientist, because according to all the theories out there, if you have an expectation and the expectation is not met, you should revise it, right? And this should lead to realism and certainly not to optimism. So after studying this question for quite a long time, the very scientific answer is this. So when something threatens us, our immediate reaction is to protect ourselves. And how do we protect ourselves? Well, one way to protect ourselves is just distancing ourselves from the threat, right? If someone says, oh, I don't think this game is going to work out, I don't think your project is going to do well, we tend to rationalize away why that's not necessarily true, or try to ignore the information altogether. Take the stock market as an example. So do you know when people log into their accounts to check on their stocks, not to make a transaction, just to have a little peek to see how much they're worth? So let me run you through this. So in black, what you see is the S&P 500 over 2 years, and in gray is a number of times that people logged into their accounts. So these numbers have been corrected for all the obvious confounds like market volume and so on. Okay, so what does it tell us? When the market is up, people expect their own stocks to be up, and so they log in all the time to get a sniff of the good news. And this without an intention to making a transaction, right? On Friday, after the market is closed, just to see how much they're worth. And when the market is down, people expect their own stocks to go down, and so they log less because they don't want to get the bad news. And all of this is true unless negative information is really hard to avoid. What you don't see here is what happened a few months later in the financial collapse of 2008 when the market went drastically down, and that's when people started logging on frantically, but it was a little bit too late. So we wanted to know what type of information really changes people's beliefs and what type of information is ignored. So we conducted an experiment where we had people come into the lab and we asked them to estimate the likelihood of experiencing all sorts of negative events, 100 different events. For example, card fraud. So what is your likelihood of being a victim of card fraud? And then we gave them information about the average likelihood for someone like them to experience this event. So card fraud can be about 70%. And then we asked them again, what is your likelihood of experiencing card fraud and other negative events? What we were interested in is whether people will take the information that we gave them to change their beliefs. And indeed they did, but mostly when the information we gave them was better than expected. So for example, if someone said, my likelihood of being a victim of card fraud is about 90%, and we said, you know, good news, it's only 70% for someone like you, they would say, okay, well, maybe it's about 75%. But if someone started off saying, I think my likelihood is about 30%, and we said, hey, bad news, the average likelihood is only 70%, the next time around they said, yeah, still think it's about 33%. So it's not that they didn't learn at all, they did. But they learned more when the information was better than they expected than when it was worse than expected. And it's not that they didn't remember the information. They remember the average likelihood of cancer, the average likelihood of divorce, the average likelihood of card fraud, but they only thought it was related to them when it was good news. So we wanted to know what goes on inside the human brain that makes us discount negative information. So we conducted the same experiment, but this time we scanned people's brains while they were solving these problems. The way that it works is the subjects come in, they lie down like that, they have a head coil that you could see. I don't know if you have. Yeah. And then there's like a mirror on top of the coil. And on that mirror, we can project anything that we want from a computer screen. So we could put words and questions and whatever. And the subjects will answer those using the button boxes in both hands. And while they do that, we scan their brain activity. So using this method, which is called functional MRI, we were able to identify parts of the brain that were responding to good news. When you heard, hey, card fraud is much less than you expected, right? And we found that quite a few regions in the brain were responding fiercely to unexpected positive information, including this region here, which is called the left inferior frontal gyrus. So it sits about here. And it didn't matter what type of person you were. You could be a highly optimistic, mildly optimistic, or even slightly depressed. Everyone's left inferior frontal gyrus was responding to good news. On the other side of the brain, the right inferior frontal gyrus was responding to bad news. And it wasn't doing a very good job. And the more optimistic someone was, according to trait questionnaires, the less likely their brain was to encode this unexpected negative information. Now, if we are not encoding negative information as well as positive information, that means that we will stay with our rose-colored glasses on. And so when people see, and so we wanted to know whether we could change that by changing people's activity, by changing their brain activity directly. And there's a way for us to do that. So this is my collaborator. And what he's doing is he's passing a small magnetic pulse through the scalp of this participant into the part of the brain that I told you about, the IFG. And by doing that, we're interrupting with the activity of that brain region for about half an hour. And after that, everything goes back to normal, or so we hope. But doing that half an hour, we conduct our task. So we could see what happens, and we did this for 30 different individuals. And before I show you the results, let me show you what will happen if I just ran the experiment on you now without interfering with your brain. This is the amount that you would learn more from positive than negative information on average. Okay? So a slight but significant amount. Now, we interfere with the part of the brain that was processing negative information. We interfere with it, and so the effect becomes even larger. And when we interfere with the part of the brain that was processing positive information, the effect disappeared. And so we were quite amazed by this because we were able to eliminate a deep-rooted bias in humans. But of course, we're not going to zap people's brains all day, right? And so what that means is that in real life, when people see warning signs such as this, they say, yes, smoking kills, but mostly it kills the other guy. But when they hear that the housing market is going up, they say, oh yeah, my house will definitely rise in price. So we end up with a view like this of ourselves. And as I said, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay? There are positive aspects to having a positive illusion. It can enhance our motivation. It can enhance our physical and mental health. However, there's also these negative aspects to this that we should be aware of. And so what can we do about it? So the first thing we can do about it is we need to identify what are the negative consequences of specific biases. For example, if we take the optimism bias, for example, you can't change your biases. It's very, very difficult to change biases and illusions. And so what we need to do is not necessarily try to change the way that we look at things, but rather figure out, okay, we look at things in this way, this leads to a lot of positive outcomes, but also to these negative outcomes. And so what are these negative outcomes and what can we do about it? And then we insert policies into our life, into our company, into our governments to correct for those. So let me give you an example of how to do that. So this is an example from the British government. They have a book that's called the Green Book, which is a book with project recommendations for appraisers. And they say in the Green Book, as I told you before, that the optimism bias causes individuals to underestimate how long projects will take and how much they will cost. And so they recommend that all the projects in the government will be adjusted for the optimism bias. And they have quite a long PDF to explain how to do that, but the basic principle is quite simple, which is you look at similar projects in the past, what the estimations were, what the outcomes were, and then you figure out the difference and add that to your project. So it sounds simple, but there is a long PDF for that. So they did that for the 2012 London Olympics, and it was one of the Olympics that was most on budget relative to other Olympics. And we can do it on our own life. We know that we tend to underestimate if we're renovating our house, right? We always think it's going to cost us less, it's going to take us less time, planning a marriage, doing projects at work, and so on. So the first important thing is to put in the policies. And the second thing is, if we know that 80% of the people around us have these biases, it really means that we need to change the way that we talk and communicate to others. Okay, so if you know that people tend to take in information that's unexpectedly positive better than information that's unexpectedly negative, that means that you could do some things about it in how you frame your message. Let me give you an example, this time from the domain of health. So we all know that washing our hands is a #1 way to prevent the spread of disease, and this is really important in hospitals and restaurants. And so in a hospital on the East Coast, a camera was installed to see how often medical staff wash their hands before and after entering a patient's room. Now, the medical staff knew that the camera was installed, right? It wasn't a nanny camera situation. Nevertheless, only 1 in 10 medical staff washed their hands before and after entering a patient's room. But then an intervention was introduced, an electronic board that told people in real time how well they were doing. They washed their hands immediately. There was someone actually in India watching them, and they changed the numbers. They gave them positive feedback, seeing like, well done, good job. And they saw the numbers going up immediately. The numbers reflected the current shift rate and the weekly rate. And what happened? Compliance raised to almost 90% and stayed there. The effect is so amazing that the scientists wanted to make sure that it's real, so they replicated it in another division in the hospital. This time, the medical staff started at 30%, and this is actually the national average, both in hospitals and in restaurants. But then, turns out that McDonald's and MGH is about the same. Don't quote me on that. And then the intervention was introduced, and again, it went up to 90%. So why does this work? And the reason it works is not about washing hands, and it's not about hospitals. It's extremely general. It works because instead of using the normal approach, what would be the normal approach? The normal approach would be to tell people, if you don't wash your hands now, this bad thing is going to happen in the future, right? Illness. And what people do, they kind of ignore it. It's like, oh, it's going to be fine. It's not. Instead of doing that, they used the 4 principles that we know really drive people's behaviors and beliefs. So let me tell you what those are. The first is social incentives. We are social people. We want to know what other people are doing. We want to do better. We want to do the same. In one study that we've conducted, we saw that when people learn about the opinions, actions, and beliefs of others, the part of the brain that I told you about, the amygdala, the one that is important for emotion, for processing emotion, was very much activated. And the more activated it was, the more likely people were to change their behavior at a later time to conform to the behavior of others. And so in the hospital study, the medical staff could see how other people are doing, right? They could see the weekly rate and the current shift rate. Again, the British government is using that to get people to pay taxes on time. For people who don't pay taxes, they usually just send them a letter and saying, really important to pay taxes, and it didn't work very well. And then they added one sentence, and that sentence said, 9 out of 10 of people in Britain pay their taxes on time. And that one sentence enhanced compliance by 15% and fought to bring into the government £5.6 billion. So social incentives is a super easy, cost-efficient way to change people's behavior. The second is immediate rewards. So we know that the part of the brain that's important for processing rewards, the nucleus accumbens, is much more activated for rewards that we can get now, immediately, than rewards that we can get in the future. So people would rather take $100 now than $110 next week. And this is not necessarily because people don't care about the future. People do care about the future. We want to be happy and successful in the future. But the future is uncertain, and that means that we can create whatever we want in our mind, right? We can say we're not going to wash our hands now, but we will be fine. We won't go to exercise now, but we'll be fine. Or, or maybe I'd even be dead, and so it doesn't matter, right? So people usually like to take the rewards now rather than something that's uncertain in the future. And again, in the hospital study, what they did is, instead of saying, if you wash now, there won't be disease in the future, they gave them reward immediately. Wash their hands, numbers went up, positive feedback went up immediately. And people do a lot of things just to get those little likes on Facebook. So we know that even positive feedback immediately is very helpful in changing behavior. But people have done this with monetary rewards as well. So there's a lot of studies showing that people stop smoking, start exercising, if you actually give them monetary rewards immediately every day. And that's much more effective, that warning of what can happen in the future. The third one is progress monitoring. So I already told you that the brain does a much better job in processing any kind of information that suggests the future can be better than information suggesting that the future can be worse. And so what does this mean? It means that we shouldn't necessarily, we should frame our message in a way to kind of highlight what could be better in the future. So this does not mean sugarcoating what we have to say. But if you want to tell someone, for example, this project is not working, it's not a good job, instead of saying it's not working and it's going to create all these negative things, instead of that, say, well, if we do A, B, C, and D, if we correct all of that, then there will be this positive outcome in the future. So framing things in order to say how we can get better, not necessarily how things can get worse. And the last one is perceived control. So one of the main things of what the brain is trying to do is trying to control its environment to gain rewards and avoid harm. That's the number one thing that the brain is trying to do. It's not there for thinking. Thinking is in order for us to be able to control our environment. And so if we give people a sense of control, they will be much more highly motivated to take action, and they will also appreciate the options better. So we know that if we give people 2 options, let's say you have to decide between 2 projects. One project requires you to work in London, and the other project requires you to work in New York. And you can't choose. They both seem really great, but you need to choose, and you say, OK, I'm going to choose New York. What we find is that seconds after someone makes a choice, they change the way that they view their options. They immediately say, oh, thank God I chose New York. London is gray and rainy, and New York I can see great theater. So they reevaluate the options in their mind. But it only happens when people make their own choices. So giving people a couple of choices is always a good idea to change their perception, 2 or 3 choices. not too many choices. You've probably heard of the jam study, when people are given to choose between 60 different jams. Even if it's for free, they just leave the store empty-handed. So too many choices overwhelm people. Okay, so these strategies can work in many situations and for many people, but it is important to consider the mental state of the person in front of us, because our mental state changes the way that we process information. So for example, under stress, we know that people suddenly become much more focused on negative. So for example, after financial collapse, people start listening to all kind of negative information, so they become hyper-focused on the negative. That negative information changes their worldview. They become more pessimistic, which makes them more stressed, which makes them become more receptive to negative information, and so on. Same thing after terrorist attack. So even if the terrorist attack is halfway around the world, people become stressed, and then they start listening to all these negative information, which creates their perception that they are under threat, even if they're not necessarily under threat. Same thing after natural disasters. And interestingly, this interacts with age. So if you look at how stress changes throughout age, it's quite low in teenagers and kids, and then it goes up, 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 hitting peak at your midlife and then starting going down again. And happiness goes the other way. So happiness is quite high in teenagers and kids. It slightly goes down, 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 hits rock bottom at your midlife. But the good news is it starts going up again. And it actually remains quite high until the last 1 or 2 years of life. So the question is, if you're kind of dealing with someone like this, how do we then enhance motivation and enhance optimism? And the answer here takes us back to imagination. Because what makes people happy is not necessarily what's happening in the moment, but what they believe will happen in the future. And let me give you a few examples to kind of make the point, and then what we can do knowing that. For example, there was a study conducted at Harvard where people, before going on vacation, for a whole week before going on vacation, every day had to say how happy they were. The whole week of vacation had to say how happy they were, and the whole week after vacation had to say how happy they were. So do you know when people were the happiest? Right, the day before. So they were sitting in the office on their computer, but that was the happiest day, right? Before they even got on the plane. Because in their mind, they were already on vacation, and in the mind, the image looked like this. Now, when they got on vacation, it was pretty good, but not as good as it was the day before in their mind. Let me give you one other example. So this is a study conducted by George Lowenstein, a behavioral economist, where he asked people to select a celebrity and imagine getting a kiss from a celebrity. So choose a celebrity, imagine getting a kiss from that celebrity, and now he asked them, how much were you willing to pay if you got the kiss immediately? So the person comes into the room, gives you the kiss now and here, or you get the kiss in 3 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, 1 year, 10 years. And what he found was that people were willing to pay the most to get the kiss in 3 days. So they were willing to pay in order to wait. Now, they didn't want to wait 10 years. No one wants an elderly celebrity. But 3 days was the optimal amount. So why is that? Well, if you get the kiss now, it's over and done with, right? If you get the kiss in 3 days, well, that's 3 days of pure anticipation, the thrill of the wait, right? And the people wanted that. Let me give you another example. So this also explains why people prefer Friday to Sunday. So this seems a little bit odd, right? Because if you ask people about which day they prefer Friday, but Friday is a day of work, and Sunday is a day of pleasure. So is it that people would rather be in the office than out in the park? We know that's not true, because the ultimate most favorite day of the week is Saturday, then Friday, then Sunday. People prefer Friday because Friday brings with it the anticipation of the weekend ahead, right? What they're doing is they're sitting there, but they're imagining the weekend. On Sunday, what they're doing is they're imagining the work week, and that's not as much fun. And so anticipation via imagination makes people happy. And so to enhance motivation and well-being, one thing we could do is create anticipatory events, right? Always have these events that people can look forward to, whether it is in group, in our work, or even on our personal life. You know, get back from holiday, we organize the next one. You don't necessarily have to get on the plane, but you just have to plan ahead for it. So, maybe just a quick question. The 20 minutes left, that's out of an hour, or the 45 minutes?
Out of an hour,
yeah. Of the hour, so 5 more minutes. Okay, great. Okay, right, so people are not usually aware of all these biases. They don't know how their brain works. They're not aware of the optimism bias. In fact, when I bring people into the lab, and this is especially true in the UK, they say, no, I'm not an optimist, you know, I'm even like a pessimist, so definitely a realist. And then you test them, you know, test what they predict will happen, then you see what actually happens, and you look at the difference, and everyone has a bias, or at least 80% of the population has a bias. So we're not necessarily aware of what's going on in our mind, but becoming aware of it has many advantages. So first of all, as I say, if we know how other people's brains work, well, that makes us much more effective in communicating, giving advice, and giving information, right? We know about, for example, reframing the message. Instead of telling your teenage son that if he smokes, he will get cancer, you might say, if you don't smoke, you'll be more likely to get on the basketball team, right? Reframing in a positive way. We learn how to restore motivation as needed, for example, by creating anticipatory events, and also protect ourselves from the not negative consequences of these bias, such as planning in a suboptimal way by putting in policies. And that is, as I said, really important because what people think is they think, oh, I can change my own biases, but that's a really difficult thing to do. And I already told you that, but I want to show you that. And in order to show you that, I want to show you a visual example. So I want you to look at this and tell me what you say. So upside down photo of a smiling girl. Has anyone seen this before? 1, 2, okay. Okay, let's test this. So when I put it upright, it's quite clear that something's wrong. Right? This is actually called the Thatcher illusion because it was first demonstrated on Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who wasn't known for her smiles. And the way to do that is you cut the mouth and the eyes, you rotate them and paste them back. And the reason that it works is because our brain does a really good job at processing upright faces. We do it all the time, right? So we're experts at it. Any slight kind of something wrong and we get it. But our brain is not very good at processing upside down faces simply because we don't do it very often. And so we are really bad at detecting any kind of oddities with upside down faces. Now, what is the point of this? The point of this is that although I explained the illusion to you and you saw it unfold, you're still fooled, right? And it's obvious, you see that. But that's true also for these cognitive biases and the emotional biases that I told you about. You will get the data, you'll believe me, it won't change the way you see things, but it gives you the empowerment to use that knowledge in different ways.